Thanks for joining us on Obsessed with Assessment podcast. On this show, we approach educational assessment from all sorts of angles and we seek the treasure within. I'm Sam Denno, secondary teacher and assessment lead at Twinkle Educational Publishing, and this is Emma Rose-McHale.
Hello, I'm Emma, former primary teacher. I'm now looking after the primary and secondary STEM team here.
So I recently sat down with assessment guru Dr Mick Walker for an in-depth conversation about his career working at a senior level for or with numerous assessment bodies, including the National Curriculum Council, Ofqual, the DFE, and the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors. We're going to hear a part of our conversation in which we talk about getting assessment right for our pupils. And following that, Emma and I will wrap up the episode with some reflections and key takeaways based on what Dr. Mick says.
It was a maths exam in the school hall, and I was invigilating. And at the end of the exam, all the usual stuff about, stop writing, put your pens down, off you go, which they all did, except for one lad called Charlie, who was right at the back of the hall. Charlie was a big, strong lad. He stood up and he picked up his table, those little tables that you use for exams in sports halls, yeah. The wire, the metal frame. He picked it up, put it over his shoulder, paper in his hand, and started walking to the front. And as you can imagine, he kept snagging it on chairs, and he was raking havoc as he walked out. Right. So there's three of us stood at the front thinking, what the hell is he doing? Anyway, Charlie came up, and he came up to me, God love him, and he handed me his paper, which I said, thank you very much, Charlie, that's very kind, but you didn't need to do that. We will collect them. And he says, and here's this, and he just handed me this table, which he could do without any strain. So I said, we don't need the tables, Charlie. There's another exam this afternoon, but leave it there. I'll put it back. And he says, no, don't put it back. What about that? Pointing at the table. I said, no, I'll put it back, Charlie. It's not a problem. He says, no, don't put it back. So what about that? I said, what do you mean by that? And he pointed at the top of the table to some carvings, obviously fresh carvings. So I said, what is this? And he said, it's some of my answers, sir. So I said, answers to what? And he said, question, whatever it was, question 6. Remember, it was a maths exam. And it said in the exam, this was a series of questions on logarithms. And it said, when answering questions 4, 5, and 6, use the tables provided. So Charlie had engraved his answer on the table. So to get Jerry Gaunt down, head of maths, we took like the equivalent of brass rubbings or whatever it was. There were three of us trying to note down which were his musings about. I mean, poor lad, none of it was right anyway, but that didn't matter, So we had to compile these scribbles plus this brass rubbing type thing. And then Jerry wrote a letter that we put in with the exam scripts to the examiner saying, this candidate had answered this question on the tabletop. But I mean, obviously it was kind of it made us giggle a bit, but it was kind of all the rest of the day I'm thinking, well, I kind of see his point a little bit here, that I can understand where it came from, when you look at lads like Charlie. And that just got me on to thinking about the way that we write questions and the way that people interpret. And it was roughly the same time I'd been asked to write in fact, the first term I was teaching, Gordon Cottrell, my then head of department, said, oh, there's an end of term exam. Can you just write 5 or 6 questions? I said, yeah, and what? He said, no, just 5 or 6, because there were about 4 or 5 groups, in the year group. Yeah. So the other teachers were also told to write 4 or 5 questions. And then Gordon was going to take those to the school secretary, would then type them up, this is going back some years now. And then the papers will be reproduced on a bander. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or seen a bander, one of those. It was a machine that you used to, to replicate papers. So we each of us timed up these, half a dozen questions. And then over the Christmas holiday, I was marking these things. And to be honest, I'd got half the questions from old O-level papers, because as a young teacher, I hadn't a clue really what to do. And I was afraid to admit I don't know quite how to put these in, so I just nicked some questions. Anyway, but I was marking this stuff over the holiday. And what I noticed was that, some of the questions weren't answered because the kids hadn't been taught this stuff as yet. So, this is poor stuff.
Yeah.
And then there was a couple of questions where the kids were getting the answers wrong, but they were getting them wrong in exactly the same way. And I started thinking, where the hell have they got that idea from? And then you start to think, well, there's only one source that they could have got that wrong from. That was me. So, and it made me reflect on my teaching. So from there on in, and it absolutely got stuff. I used to say to some of the kids, I want to give you just a little test. I suppose now people somehow classify it as formative, but what I was doing was testing myself. And I was saying to the kids, don't worry about it, just have a go at it. I'm not judging you, I'm judging me. Because I wanted to check, have the kids got this? Because I was so nervous about, this previous experience.
Yeah.
I'm teaching these kids things that they'd misinterpreted stuff. I'd embedded a misconception. I'd obviously done it well. The teaching skills were obviously immaculate. That's just the content came across as all wrong. I suppose within months of starting, I started to pick up on, this assessment stuff is important and crucial, because when we trained as teachers, it was never mentioned. No mention of assessment. You just kind of, you did history of education, sociology of education, and philosophy of education, but stuff about, pedagogical things, but no one talked about assessment. And I'm still not convinced it's all that much better now. It's still in a position where I think teachers are not properly prepared in all things assessment.
And that's very much sort of my starting point with the role that I've got at Twinkle at the moment. But as I've explored it, over the course of conversations with people like you, podcasts and so on, and via reading, it's just the world has got bigger and bigger and bigger, because all of a sudden there are so many aspects of assessment that as a classroom teacher I didn't have the first clue about. It has made me sort of realise, wow, I was incredibly naive in the classroom.
I don't know why would you? It's still not really embedded. I know the Carter Review 2015. I think within that, because I met with David and the panel and stuff, and we talked about this. But I remember in the final report, it said that the aspect that is kind of dealt with worst in teacher preparation is around assessment. That was one of the most severe findings, if you like.
Right.
It's the least well-developed part of teacher instruction or teacher education. And I know that we've got various frameworks that have come out since, but they're kind of just one-liners, about, teachers should know about assessment or something. There's no depth. And interestingly, the Carter Review, it talked about the lack of knowledge within schools, and then also the lack of knowledge around assessment theory and practice in institutions that educated teachers. And again, this has not been, I've often said that teachers are poor at assessment, and then I've got to get a very quick next sentence in, because I'm not having a pop at them. Because teachers are bright people, they tend to be intelligent folk. It's just that no one's really spent any time talking to them and instructing them about assessment. So, why would they know much about it? So, I think it's a big flaw in our system. And yet it's not about assessment for exams and the like. This is about, the basics of teaching and learning, because it's so, I always class it as the fulcrum on which teaching and learning balance, that if you haven't got the assessment right, you can't check that teaching is landing, that any learning has taken place. So it's absolutely crucial. And oddly enough, teachers do it second by second anyway. They're just not often conscious of it. They're constantly looking at the kids' faces, or marking books, or walking around and looking at the work, etc. So that it's in there, but it's not formalised, so that people make errors around it. People don't quite understand how to maybe do it right, if I can use that phrase, or how to do it better, because they're just kind of running on instinct a little bit.
That was Dr. Mick Walker speaking to me earlier. So, Emma, from that, we need to arrive at some key takeaways for our listeners.
Bit of a summary.
I loved what Mick said about, he spoke about setting tests that are designed to test him and what his students have learnt from him, as opposed to test the students.
I think a lot of teachers are a little bit nervous of that. I think they're quite nervous of the idea that a poor assessment score reflects badly on them, rather than necessarily using it as okay, if the whole class didn't know this, what was I missing when I, taught this unit or term or whatever.
But it doesn't need to be sort of like publicized results, does it? It can just be like you set a small test in your classroom, and again, like I say, you're using that to measure your own performance effectively, and not your pupils. And what I really love about that is it sort of turns it on its head, because I used to think about, if I taught something in a class and a pupil didn't get it, I would see that as that pupil's failure. And yet,
it's how you phrase it as well. You phrase it as that, don't they? Let's find out which of them didn't get it.
Yeah.
Like who didn't get it and who did. Not if 50% of the class didn't get this, maybe that was on me and my explanation.
So that as a starting point then to sort of examining ourselves and sort of questioning whether, okay, so has the teaching landed as I intended it to land? And I think often the problem is that we'll ask what seems like a sensible question during the lesson, and then we just get a tumbleweed moment where no one gets it, and then we move on and we forget about it. And actually, I think what Mick was encouraging was that as educators, we need to be more sort of curious about, well, why didn't that land? I need to dig into why didn't that land, and be more sort of self-analytical going forward.
You can see a lot of use in that. Like, I feel like there's use on that year on year as well. Like, wouldn't it be really interesting if you had, I don't know, I think from a primary point of view, say, if you did, it's an end of unit assessment at the end of this multiplication and division unit I've done with these year 4 children. If you did that year on year and you were good at record keeping, you could see if there was a particular year that children perform worse, and like, was it the cohort or was it you, or can you improve year on year?
Immediately it makes you think, oh, but what about time? Is there an efficient way that we can do this?
That is the big teacher crisis at the minute, isn't it? Workload.
I mean, so I was wondering, like, just having a notebook with me whilst teaching, and just so if you put out a question, nobody answers, okay, just write that question down, and then maybe spend like 2 minutes at the end of the lesson thinking, that didn't work. I think it's so easy, isn't it, in teaching, just to keep on moving, just never to reflect, never to really look back and say, okay, so what about me? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing right?
You're told to be reflective. I mean, I would say that is actively encouraged at, say, like at teacher training stage. People are going into the initial teacher training and you're told to be reflective, and it takes up a massive amount of your time to be that level of reflective when you're just teaching, say, a 30-50% timetable that you might be as a student. And then when you're teaching 100% of the time, you are present all of the time. There's the chance to reflect. And maybe that's something that could be taken on board by teaching leadership, that actually the reflection part isn't just letting people sit around thinking about, oh, was I good or not today? There's real value in it.
In terms of our own assessment setting, then I think we could consider the following questions. Are we using the right language to ask a question? And when I say right language, like, are we setting that question at the right level? And you can think about Bloom's taxonomy and all those different sort of phases of learning. So if a student is at recall stage, then we shouldn't be asking them a question that is asking them to kind of offer a critical analysis of a piece of learning or whatever. So that's sort of one thing to think about. And then I wonder if there could be misconceptions about the way we've framed a question. So when we're devising a question to ask our pupils, we need to think about, well, will that lead them towards a misconception?
Do you know that I think we've all been there. Like I'm a primary. I've taught from reception to year 6, so like small children. I used to be a nursery nurse as well. So small children in particular, you can think of loads of examples where you ask the question and they all just do that, just mouth open, and you go, there is no way that none of them know it. I've phrased it in a way that was even just ad hoc. We're on the carpet. I'm going to ask you a question. So the chances that you're doing it in other places, whether it's written or not, are really high. I once did an arithmetic test at the beginning of a year 2, I want to say, year 2, like a baseline assessment. And one of the questions was, write the number 17 in figures. This little boy did correctly, did a 1 and a 7 as a digit, but drew it inside a little person, like on its belly, because he'd heard write the number 17 in figures, and he'd gone, I've got a context for figure, it's a person.
Yeah.
And I gave him the mark because he did do a 1 and a 7 as a digit, as digits. But it was really cute that he, phrasing it in a way that was a strange word for a child to hear, like write it in figures.
And then one other thought about our questioning is does our questioning build on prior knowledge, or are we asking pupils to make a huge leap of imagination? Like if we've not taught them the basics, they're not going to be able to answer the rocket science question at the end. And sometimes I think we just jump straight to that. So there you are. There's a few considerations then when it comes to setting assessment questions. There's another short segment from Mick where he offers advice about embedding key language at an early stage, which is kind of adjacent to some of the language comments he made in the main piece.
Tim Oates, who chaired the last curriculum review, had this lovely thing about dialogue and use of terminology. And if there's a chance in a primary school to talk about gravity, if something falls, use the word gravity and explain it the best you can, because it plants that little seed that, even though it might not be taught until key stage 3, there's something in that child's mind that it starts to formulate the idea. And using the correct language is one of the things he pushes, because he started on this when marking some GCSE chemistry papers years and years ago, where this school, all the kids were writing about this, using this white gooey stuff to do this particular experiment. I think it's agar or whatever to grow a culture. But the teacher hadn't said it's agar. They basically said, use this white gooey stuff. So all the kids thought this is what they call it. So, sometime later they're writing to GCSE about white gooey stuff.
So, well, thank you for listening. You can reach us on assessment@twinkle.co.uk. Please like, subscribe, leave comments, and there will be much more of this gold. In fact, there's going to be more Dr. Mick Walker. We've got all the Dr. Mick to come, and we'll see you next time.